serve as president of the county council, and I would like to welcome everyone here. It's good to see our county commissioners, our city council colleagues, and the mayor, and it's also good to see the city clerk, Ms. Bolden. We don't always have an opportunity to meet around a table like this, so I want to extend a warm welcome to you. And I know that at the last meeting of the elected officials on September 16th, it was decided that the city council and the county council would come together for another meeting to discuss a few items regarding the convention center, primarily the financial piece of this. And it was decided at that time that the president of the city council and myself as president of the county council would lead the meeting. And President Rollo will be serving as parliamentarian. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I will be chairing tonight's meeting. Tonight's agenda was prepared by both the county council staff and county council members, as well as input from the city council and city council staff. And it certainly is intended to be a conversation with feedback about the project of the convention center. Therefore, we were not planning to have any consultant presentation or any presentation from the steering committee. Based on that, it was a conversation for the electeds. There are people, though, who are here who can help speak on different matters that we're talking about and answering our questions when we have them. So we appreciate that you've traveled all this way to be here. We have several members of the community who are also here, and it's good to see you here as well. So thank you. And for those who are watching on CATS, we appreciate you tuning in. We do have a full agenda, and to keep things on task, we are hoping to keep the meeting about an hour and a half and hopefully adjourn at the latest 8:30. But we'll see how that goes. We certainly want to get through all of our agenda items. Moving on to the first substantive item of business, we want to look at the financial and budget, have a financial and budget discussion, and first by discussing the estimated construction and renovation costs. When we first looked at the project, there were different amounts that we were looking at. We had a plan that was a 20,000 square foot plan at about 33 million, a 30,000 square foot plan that was 44 million, and then a 40,000 square foot plan that was approximately 54 million. And at the last meeting, it was discussed that that option was large and not necessarily viable in the direction that we wanted to go, and that was taken off the table at the time. Correct? It's too expensive. So I thought we put on the first item on the agenda would be to continue that conversation looking at option A and option B. And I know that Mr. Underwood with the city is here to give that presentation. So if you want to come for the first agenda item, we'll make space for you here at the table for sure. That's a good question. Nicole, if you want to come right over here, I would love to have you here. Is there?
Yeah, there's a seat.
Okay. You can also. Pardon?
Speak from the podium, I guess.
I think it's too difficult to speak from the podium. I think come right up here would be great.
There's no mic.
There's no mic. Is there a mic over by you, Margie?
No, there isn't. That's for cats. They'll have to share one over here.
Jeff, I'm actually going to have you sit right
there we
here. Is that a mic? Okay.
Yeah, there we go. Great. Thanks,
And I'm
Jim.
going to
Mine won't stretch.
move out of the way here. It's mine. Okay, here's the presentation.
And you're giving the presentation. Included in our packet, we all do have from the city what we will be looking at, the Bloomington-Monroe County Convention Center project, city and county council inquiries. If you want to follow along, please do so.
Good evening, Jeff Underwood, City Controller. With me tonight is Buzz Crone with Crone and Associates, who is our financial advisor, and Bruce Donaldson with Barnes and Thornburg, who is our bond counsel on this particular project. As we noted, we received a list of questions from the county that we put in a presentation and sent out to everyone. Buzz is actually going to go through that, and I'll be available to talk to him as well on what we're going to present. So the good news is we have the funds for both the expansion of the convention center and for a garage. We're going to start with the convention center. We've updated the slides that we presented at the last meeting, so Buzz will go through that, and then we have specific questions that were asked, and we will provide you with that in the presentation, and Buzz will go through those exhibits.
Before we get started with this, I would like to ask for a friendly amendment to our agenda. I think it would make sense to have Mr. Underwood present the parking garage immediately following. I know that's item C on our agenda, but I'd like to amend it, go from A, C, then to B.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Wonderful, thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I think they were going to have the PowerPoint hooked up, but while we're waiting for that, there it is.
Can you make sure you pull that mic close to your mouth, please? Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
I don't have the mouse to do the flip through here, but there we go. As Jeff indicated, we're going to try to answer the series of questions. There were a lot of good questions that were posed after the last meeting, and we're going to try to go through those. We'll get to those real quickly. Can we go to the next slide? Actually, one more slide, please. Okay, we're going to just do a quick review. We looked at some of these. We do have another month under our belt with the food and beverage tax distributions for September distributions were about $235,000. That's a new number that wasn't in the presentation the last time. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. And again, we added that September information to the chart that shows the month-by-month distributions. The rolling average is about a little over $3 million. We took out the high and the low. That was a very good suggestion that came from, I believe, one of the county council members at the last meeting. And with that, it was about $2.97 million, taking out the highest month and the lowest month in that, out of that 12-month rolling average. And once we get October's number, that big high number will drop off the chart. The October 18, as was brought up at the last meeting, that may have been a catch-up month when a lot of the folks that maybe hadn't gotten used to making those payments came all in one month and skewed that average. So, but we're still hovering right around $3 million as our rolling average, adjusting for that high and the low month out of those figures. Let's go to the next slide. And what we did here is we broke this matrix down into 4 options, where we took the option 1 reflects the 20-year term of a proposed food and beverage bond, and options 3 and 4 reflect a 25-year term. Options 1 and 3 assume that we would have a little more conservative bond sizing by using 110% coverage factor for just the food and beverage revenue. And then options 2 and 4 would be a 1-for-1 coverage. So we're looking at a range of roughly $39 million to $49 million in those 4 different options in terms of bond sizing. And I think it sounds like we're zeroing in on more in that $44 million range as opposed to the $54 million option that was mentioned earlier. One other thing we put at the bottom was if we took the baseline, which is our most current 12-month average, and indexed that for 1% annual growth, in year 5, we would be looking at roughly $3.2 million in annual food and beverage revenues, year 10, about 3.3, year 15, 3.5, and so on, as we get out to later years. That's just a 1% index factor. And that's just for information only, not for we're not trying to size the bond for growth, but we're just trying to illustrate what that might be. Let's go on to the next slide. Options 5 and 6 is where we looked at just that 10-month average, where we took the high and low months out of our 12-month rolling average and came up with the 2.97 million. And whether it's a 20-year or 25-year bond, we're still in that roughly $42 to $48 million range. So we feel pretty comfortable that $44 million project range is achievable. Let's go on to the next slide, because we'll start getting into some of the questions that came up after the last meeting. And I'm just going to read through a few of these, and then we'll address them in a series of slides, and then there's additional ones that we'll address a little bit later. But one of the questions was, is a 1-for-1 ratio, which would represent 100% coverage factor, too risky for the bond issuance, or should a more conservative coverage be considered? The second question that sort of all relates to this is a local income tax backup the right choice for this bond? What would the impact be on local income tax if the backup was called into play? Another question, is there any source of backup that would be better, i.e. TIF or property tax? And then would TIF be an option as a backup for this bond issuance, or is there not capacity in the city's combined TIF district? So the next series of slides, we're going to try to hit all those points for you. So let's talk about the next slide, please. Debt service coverage. Let's just take a minute to talk about that. Debt service coverage is the ratio of the pledged annual revenues divided by the annual debt service payments. Debt service coverage obviously drives the bond sizing capacity. Obviously, we've got to be able to at least make our bond principal and interest payments. So the 100% coverage factor is basically 1-for-1. That's where we would size the bond issue to equal what we feel comfortable with as the annual food and beverage revenue stream. And again, this is just the city's portion of the food and beverage revenue, so I want to make that point clear. Or the 110% coverage from only using about 91% of that annual food and beverage revenue. That would establish a more conservative bond size determination. So that's a little basic understanding of debt service coverage. And now let's go to the next slide, where we'll talk about credit enhancements. And this is where we've sort of focused on the local income tax as the desired credit enhancement for this transaction, where the city could pledge its local income tax as a backup. Doesn't mean that we ever intend to use local income tax for paying bonds. We have other fallbacks that we'll talk about here in just a moment, but the local income tax pledge would hopefully enable us to get the city's general obligation bond rating, which S&P has a AA rating for the city of Bloomington. That's a very strong bond rating, and that would be the reason we would want to use local income tax. We could consider property tax backup. It's just It's not as good as local income tax because of tax caps. It sort of exasperates the circuit breaker issues. We wouldn't intend to use that either, but we feel like the local income tax pledge is actually a stronger pledge for the bond rating agencies than even a property tax. They're both very strong, but with the local income tax, it doesn't have the negative connotation that putting a property tax back up might have publicly, and there's it's just we just feel that the local income tax would be the best form of a formal backup to credit enhance the food and beverage revenue bond. The plan would be to invoke that LIT or local income tax pledge, but the only reason to do that would be to get the maximum possible bond rating and minimize the interest costs on the convention center bonds. The city would first utilize, in the event there were an annual shortfall in the food and beverage tax revenue, we would first make that up with the food and beverage reserves that we've already accumulated approximately $4 million in the last 18 months. And by next summer, that should be a much stronger number. So we feel that there's going to be a sufficient reserve for in place before we even issue the bonds that could absorb a pretty significant shortfall every year for the next 20 or 25 years. That would be the number one fallback, and there will be a debt service reserve fund pledged out of those existing food and beverage revenues. The second fallback would be to consider TIF, and we'll get more into more detail on the TIF in some later slides, but there is significant amounts of TIF that would exceed the bond obligations that the city currently has and proposes to have with the new parking garage for the convention center. So let's go on to the next slide. And we'll talk a little bit about the debt reserve. I think I've already alluded to it. We've accumulated about $4 million already in the last 18 months. By next summer, we feel that's going to probably be somewhere in the $6 million range. And again, that would be sufficient to absorb, if we had a $200,000 or $250,000 food and beverage revenue decline, we still have enough to absorb that for the next 20 years with the funds that are accumulating right now in those in that reserve fund for this convention center bond issue. So with that, if I'm going too fast, please stop me, but I think this is...
We can push pause and see if there are any
Yeah,
questions.
does anybody need to take a breath?
I'm saying keep going.
Okay, let's go to risk mitigation on the next slide. Again, the pledge, the LIT backup, using that as a backup, it eliminates risk for investors and the bond rating agencies. The city's risk in pledging the local income tax as a credit enhancement, we feel is very minimal for the reasons we've already discussed. The fact that we'll have a significant debt service reserve from the accumulated food and beverage revenues, and we have TIF as a secondary backup. So the intent is never to use LIT to make these bond payments, but it's the best form of credit enhancement for this particular transaction. The intent is never to take that away. If we did, obviously that would shortchange the city's. Thank you very much. Sorry, I had to recharge. No problem. Thank you. The accumulated balances again are going to be significant to absorb any temporary food and beverage shortfalls, and again, we never intend to use that local income tax for the convention center bond payments.
Click again, left click,
On the right click?
left,
Left.
now scroll.
Sorry, I think I went too far. This one goes-
There you go.
Okay, here we go. I think I got it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, you just use the scroll wheel and it should be fine.
It just needed a little more cheese and mouse and the cheese. Okay, this is an illustration of a 20-year bond, and we've sized this at the one-for-one coverage. Those numbers are awfully hard to see, even on the printed copies, but that's roughly a $43 million bond size. We assumed about a 3.6% net interest cost. You see that the annual debt service payments are roughly $3 million a year. So just to summarize on the convention center bonds, again, we're focusing on potential sizing scenarios at either a 100% or 110% coverage ratio and a 20 or 25-year term. We feel comfortable that we can cover the $39 to $49 million bond sizing range with that type of range in terms. Again, we feel the local income tax backup is the best form of credit enhancement for this project. We think it's better than property tax backup. There's a number of reasons we don't want to use TIF because we need our coverage for the next convention center parking garage bond, and we'll get into that in just a moment, but we don't want to dilute that coverage on this project since we don't have to. And again, the lid would be a stronger pledge than the TIF. So for those reasons, we feel that, again, the risk of ever having to use local income tax is very minute, and with the other two backups we have. And none of these numbers assume any growth in the annual food and beverage revenue projections. So that's another key point. Boy, that's good timing. Good, yeah.
And that no growth includes inflation. You're not figuring in inflation.
Yeah, we did not put inflation in any of these numbers. This is today's, roughly $3 million is where we are right now. That's pulling out the high and the low months we've got so far. So those are today's dollars, and we've not inflated those. So with that,
So at this point, that's the conclusion for the convention center. We'd be happy to take questions about the presentation on the convention center, and then we'll roll into the garage itself.
We can take questions on the left.
Just a point of order, Mr. Underwood can't be heard by cats. Please use whatever microphone you have there close to you. Thank you.
We'll begin with questions, and we'll start on my left.
do you have a question?
Thank you. Yes, I do. Has there been a discussion on preference for the 20-year or 25-year bond from your part? Is there a preference? I know both are an option, but what would you prefer?
That's a good question. I guess it depends on how much we need. As we get closer to, I would feel comfortable with either option. We did have a 30-year term, I think, when in some of the other illustrations. We think that probably between year 20 and 25 that convention center may start needing some rehabilitation, and that, but I don't, whether it's 20 or 25, I don't think it would have a material impact one way or another, but it's a good question.
Thank you.
Other questions on my left?
You may have indicated this at the beginning, but, and they said, I apologize if that's the case, but I'm wondering, what would be the impact to the interest rate, I guess specifically, but overall, of not using a local income tax as the backup? You said it gets us the best rating, but what materially is the difference?
It would be relatively significant, particularly if, we would still pre-fund a debt service reserve fund, which obviously is, we would definitely need to have a minimum of 110% coverage or more to get good rates. But I would say you're probably looking at 25 to 50 basis point difference in the interest rate, which on a big, relatively significant bond amount, that would be a lot of money over 20 or 25 years. Probably would push things out to a longer term, but it would just be a better, any revenue bond, if we want to have cover, be able to get the most bang for our buck, we need some sort of a credit enhancement to save that money for all the taxpayers here in the county.
The last TIF bond that we did, we got a AA minus rating versus a AA. So you drop down in the rating, which increases the interest rate because they see that as a greater risk. So on a straight revenue bond, you typically see those being at a lesser rating than your general obligation rate. So in the city's case, AA is the highest rating that we get. The LIT gives us that ability to bump it back up to a AA, achieve a better interest rate. And in the market, when we sell those bonds, they're more attractive to investors the higher the rating. So,
yeah, that TIF bond that Jeff mentioned right now has a coverage ratio of about 185%. So the difference between that and 100 or 110% is a big factor. So I'd echo his comments on that.
Thank you.
Could somebody remind us what the 44 million includes? Does that include contingency costs that might come up for kind of unknown things that we're just not aware of?
Bond estimate includes the issuance cost, so that's bond counsel, financial advisor, the underwriter cost, the design cost, and a contingency on the construction as well. So it's an all-in cost.
So what would the contingency be as a percentage of the 44 million?
I'd have to double check the number. I think we were at about between 5 and 10% of the estimated construction cost, which is typical for a project that size.
Usually they use 10% in a pre-design, and then they narrow it down to about 5 after it's completely designed. But I would guess it's about 10% also. I'll agree with Jeff on that.
And just to clarify, the 44 million does not include the renovation, or does it? Okay.
That's all-in construction cost
Okay.
for the 30,000 plus the renovation.
Okay.
It does not include the garage.
Right. Thanks.
So just to make sure that I've heard it clearly, when we're looking here, of course, on our agenda, at the 20,000 square foot, 30,000 square foot, you're saying that under the bond schedule you've got listed here, both options covered under the provisions that you're describing. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's about 43 million, and there's going to be funds that could be, if it comes out to 44 million instead of 43 million, there's going to be some of that food and beverage fund that they could apply to that. But in terms of the bond size, we've assumed 43 million and 20-year term.
And so with the 44, some shaving here or there to get that. But then my follow-up question is, just to go back, the 20-year, you're saying maybe not a hard recommendation, but 20-year gets you paying this off before maintenance begins eating you as you got a car that needs some serious maintenance.
That would be ideal, but again, as the design progresses and if, I think that there's a balancing act there, obviously, but I would feel comfortable, there's not a whole lot of difference between 20 and 25, but 20 would, I'm going to answer your question now, I guess. We'd like to see the 20-year, that would be nice, but if we needed to stretch it out to 25 to make it all work, that's not a deal
The
breaker.
guy would have to make sure the payments get made. I'm comfortable with the 25 years, as we've talked to the design team about how long things will last. We've talked to the folks at the convention center now. They've made me comfortable that a 25-year term will be sufficient.
I remember when they tore the Hoosier Dome down, and they still owed bonds on that up in Indianapolis, but we're not stretching it out that far.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the is there any kind of a soft encumbrance that happens to the lit as a result of it being a backup? In other words, does it affect our ability to borrow off of the lit, or do we have to increase the lit in anticipation of the possibility that it might need to be a backup? Like when you put backup in quotes, what does it practically mean for the use of the lit?
I'll talk about that and it comes back to me. Yeah, so it's the difference between what we look at is, do we actually have the money to make the debt service payments? And then for the rating agencies and the investors, they like to see a cushion that says the revenue stream is sufficient at about 1.5 times. So while it's a pledge, it doesn't affect your ability to then utilize those funds later on. Now, we don't have any anticipation that we would do a lit bond per se, but we would still have that ability to do so. Currently, we have 2 streams of lit available to us. There's 3 that we can utilize. So currently, the city and the county utilize what we call distributive shares, and that's the ones that go to all the individual units. What we're saying in here is that's where if we would ever need to use that as a backup, it would come out of the city's distributive share. There's also public safety, which mainly is for dispatch. The city and county and Steinsville and Ellisville gets a share of that as well. And then there's what they call an economic development bucket that we've not implemented at this time. But it would not impact our ability to, one, either increase that tax if the bodies decided that there was use, or to bond against that.
So if I understand it correctly, let's say we have a $3 million a year payment. What the agencies want to see is that we have the ability to cover $4.5 million. Is that like? That's correct. And so like whatever revenue streams we have coming in through the lit, and we have, it's 6 or 7 million right now. Right. So in other words, we can count all of that towards our ability to pay, and we don't have to set it aside in case it needs to be used. We just need to have.
No, the minimum requirement is a 1-year debt service reserve. And essentially what you do is kind of like your rent. You pay the last month up front. So we would put at a minimum 1 year in reserve. And there's 3 ways that you can do that. You can fund it through the debt, you can buy a surety, an insurance program, or you can fund it with cash. And I've done all 3 with different bonds. It's an economic decision as you're getting ready to sell the bonds. What is the lowest cost option to you in order to sell the bonds? But at a minimum, there would be a 1-year debt service reserve fund.
Thank you.
So I'm a little confused because you talked about 4.5 million coverage with our backup funds through lit, but then you said 1 year in reserve. That would be 6 million, right? Because the annual payment is 3.
1 year annual debt service payment, which is about $3 million. Yeah, so your debt service reserve funds 1 year's worth of debt service. That's your reserve. So when you sell the bond, you show the coverage calculation. So we say, here's the actual debt service is about $3 million a year. Do you have the money to do that? Yes. Do you have enough money in combination either with food and beverage or lit or property tax backup or TIF to show us that you have additional coverage equal to another 50%? Yes. And then finally, when you sell the bonds, you promise to your investors, we're going to put 1 year in reserve. So if something catastrophic happens, we have at least 1 year's worth of reserve funded, and that could be done through bond proceeds, a surety, basically an insurance policy, or cash.
Okay, so it's 2 different things. I was conflating there.
Yeah, so you've got 3 elements of a bond deal. The debt service, the coverage, and the debt service reserve.
In your amortization table, it's, the principal is 42.67 million, but the budget we've been talking about for the convention center is 44 million. Is that, why is the table different?
We just picked that 20-year option. You know, if we needed to fund 44 million and we still had the same revenue stream, we could maybe do 22 years and squeeze another million out of, you know. But these, until we get the design done and have really more firm numbers, these are just really illustrations, you know.
Okay, so it wasn't that there's any part of it that was left out or anything, it's just these are estimates?
Yeah, of the 4 options, we are asked to present one if we had the amortization schedule, and this is the one that we picked. Now, just a caveat is, this is a picture in time, so we're talking as if we were going to bond market today, what would things look like? So, you know, we're not that point, so these are all illustrative purposes. But the questions that were presented, we provided the answers based on those questions and what's here today.
And then I just wanted to make a comment. My last thing is not a question, that we should be careful when we talk about TIF funds being used for the parking garage, and therefore we shouldn't use them as a backup. That has not been decided yet, so that's going to be a whole other discussion of how we fund the garage.
I'm going to cover that because we're going to talk about the Convention Center garage next, and we'll get into all the TIF debt, and I think we're going to hit those points that you're thinking about.
I'll make sure everybody knows that.
That was part of that.
At this point, that is not a conclusion. All right, thank you.
At a recent city council meeting, I thought I heard it commented, well, if we go ahead and have these expenditures now, we will have it refunded back at time from the bond. So and I'm not sure that you were at that meeting, but the $4 million that's already been approved by the advisory commission, having to do with, I believe it was design and architectural fees and so forth, that, is there a plan to include that in your bond and then pay yourself back out of the bond money?
I'll take that for you. Yes, typically your bond counsel, your financial advisor, and your underwriting costs are included in the bond issue, and in this particular case, the question that was asked, is this an all-in cost? Yes, it is. It includes those 3 things, the design, so the design would get reimbursed, and then the actual hard construction and a contingency fund are all in the $44 million. So we would pay them out of pocket and then be reimbursed for those, which is allowed by the bond statutes.
I understand, but when we've already collected the money from the public for that $4 million that you have, and now we're going to collect it again from the public to pay yourselves back. And I thought that was rather curious, but thank you.
That decision made at that time. You know, we want to make sure we've got that, you know, 1-year minimum debt service reserve pre-funded, and but that may or may not, you know, that'll be a decision for as we get closer to the bond sale.
The reason why I brought that up is because if there was some way where you didn't have to put all of it into the bond, you'd have maybe some of it that you already had put forward. That's going to allow you to have the dollars for the bond and hopefully maybe keep it down to that 20-year level. But I appreciate you taking time.
That's a significant variable that can be determined, you know, once we get the final bond sizing, or, you know, the project cost sizing.
We're talking $4 million, so that would make a big difference.
Well, the other piece of that is, as we've discussed, that would be potentially saved back if there were any shortfall in the food and beverage, that it would go towards making those payments. I think the illustration that we show is at $6 million, so that as soon as we get paid back, so we have $6 million in the city's funds, again, we're not talking about the county's funds, is that would be approximately $200,000 a year over the life of the bond that would be available in addition to the debt service reserve fund. So it provides additional backup. So as Buzz said, that's a decision that can be made. So it's an offset one way or the other. You can either say, I'm not going to bond for that, but then you've reduced your reserves, or you can say, I'm going to reimburse myself, and then we have greater reserves back in the event that there's a shortfall.
And so we'll be keeping a $6 million debt service reserve fund, as I understand it. And then what happens to the excess of the food and beverage tax of the city, excess that exceeds the annual cost of the bond and that doesn't have to go to the debt service reserve fund? Is that going to be in a separate category that is maybe maintenance or
That would be a decision that we follow the normal appropriation process for the city council. If you issue, the funds come into the city, they go into a restricted fund, food and beverage. And then any use of those funds are subject to review by the Food and Beverage Commission. And they also can only be used for approved uses for food and beverage under the statute. And it would then be subject to appropriation by the city council.
Thank you.
So I have one question about lit funds as backup for the bond, and are city lit funds currently committed as backup for other city bonds?
They are not currently, we do use a portion of the city's distributive share to pay off the bonds that were issued for the Showers building.
Okay.
And those are going to mature. I believe we have 2 more payments left on that.
Okay.
Then those become available for our distributive shares, but beyond that, there are no pledge. It's utilized solely for general fund expenditures on an annual basis.
Thank you.
So I was just putting together some numbers, and even under some, and I guess this is for my colleagues as much as anything, it seems like even under some pretty pessimistic assumptions, even the year's worth of debt reserve would still be adequate to be able to fund the bond payments from the way I look at it. So I mean, I just did a kind of a model of a recession here where we had about 6 years. So I literally assumed that this year is the highest. This is peak dining. We will never be higher than this. It'll only be down. We'll have a 6-year recession and then a modest recovery. And even under that, with a lot of zeros and 1% increase, even under that grim scenario, that 1-year debt reserve fund still covers us. So I guess I just say that by way of saying that really the purpose of the lit pledge really is just to buy the higher bond rating, not to actually use it. And that's only assuming 1-year debt reserve. So it sounds like you'd have the capability of funding 2 years of debt reserves, which in the later years might be used for capital improvements, for example, as long as you've still got the minimum required, right? I mean, is that potentially a thought?
Once the bonds pay off, then the debt service reserve basically rolls back. You either use it for the last year payment or it rolls back into the city's food and beverage fund.
But I mean, even if by that time you had, $8 million in surplus, you'd still only have to keep your $1 million or your $3 million minimum for your debt reserve, and the rest could be used for, like I said, capital improvements, technological improvements.
Any allowed expense under the statute.
Thanks.
I'm just curious why Creed money has never been discussed at all as a part of this.
Well, we think when we looked at it and what the backup, basically there's sufficient funds in the food and beverage to do the issue, and that's what the food and beverage tax was instituted for. Initially was the expansion of the convention center. Beyond that, it was what gives us the best coverage and the best rating, and the lit provides that.
It's better than
Creed. Because on the CRED funds, both of those have sunset dates, and they're relatively soon. There's cash on hand, but we didn't believe that enhanced the credit at all. In fact, it would really detract from it as a backup.
Okay, thank you.
I have nothing.
At this time, we will transition, if there are no other questions, we will transition into the parking garage conversation. And I know that you have some information to offer there.
These were a series of questions that were posed after the last meeting relative to the parking garage and the TIF revenues and the consolidated TIF district that the city has. And I'm just going to quickly go through these bullet points that were raised. First of all, it is important to know if there will be TIF revenues available to build a convention center parking garage. The next bullet was, if there is an estimated debt schedule for the convention center parking garage, please provide it to us, and we'll show you an illustration there. The current consolidated TIF fund balance, list of consolidated TIF expenses, annual revenues of the consolidated TIF district, and a spreadsheet showing the various TIF sunset dates and the associated assessed value losses with each sunset date, list of any and all ongoing TIF commitments and pledges. So these next series of slides will attempt to address all of those issues that were raised. And I must say, you guys ask good questions and you raise a lot of good issues. So I hope our responses are on point here. I'm going to talk about the sunset dates first. Well, we'll see a couple slides that have sunset date information on, but our 2019 TIF revenues, and this is based on the data sheet from the auditor's office that showed what was actually billed this year. It's just under $10.5 million. In 2029, we have one of the areas that will sunset that will drop our TIF revenues by $1.5 million. Again, we've assumed no growth in the TIF areas, and these are at today's dollars. No inflated numbers for indexing or anything. Then in 2029, our TIF revenues based on today's commitments would be about $9 million. We have another one sunsetting in 2033, which would drop off another 300,000. And in 2035, we have an area that's generating roughly $50,000 or $60,000 that drops off. And then in 2037, there's an area with about 400,000 that would drop off. And that's assuming no other additional growth within any of those existing TIF areas in our consolidated area. The current combined bond payments are then shown in the next column. This year's bond payments are $4.7 million. We just sold the parking garage bonds for the 4th Street and the Trades District parking garages. They sold last week and haven't closed yet, but we have those bonds factored in to the 2020 payment. And then you can see that we have we're assuming that the convention center bonds would be issued in sometime in 2020, and then that would hit the bond payment schedule here in 2021 going forward. Some of those bonds will pay off during those periods of time. You'll see right about the time the 2029 bond or sunsets, we have the first sunset, our bond payments drop about $1 million. And then in 2032, you see they drop about 300,000, and they level out at about $5.5 million going forward. And without any growth in the existing TIF areas, we would still project about $2.8 to $3.2 million of net bond coverage for the TIF district. That's with the proposed conventions. We assume $15 million for the convention center parking garage. And we would still have coverage ratios in the 140 to 150% range. I know this is really hard to see, but you do have in your handout, and if you have a magnifying glass, this shows a 20-year amortization. We assumed 3.5% interest rate, and the annual bond payments. You'll see they go up and down a little bit because we were wrapping it around some of the other debt so we could sort of maximize our coverage in some of those years when all those bonds are outstanding. But they're roughly between $1 million and $1.2 million per year on just the convention center garage. I don't think we need to belabor that schedule too much. This one is the one that sort of puts it all together, where you'll see stacking bar charts that show the outstanding TIF bonds. The red ones are the 2015 TIF revenue bonds. The yellow bar is the 2017 refunding bonds. I guess it's orange up there. It's yellow on my handout here. But, and those will pay out in 2031. Then the light blue bars are the bonds that were just sold just this past week. Those are for the 2 parking garages that the city is undertaking at 4th Street and the Trades District garage. And then the darker blue would reflect the proposed convention center bonds, which in 2020 we would just have probably interest payment only in 2020, but then the full debt service would kick in 2021. And the line chart above shows the projected TIF revenues based on what we're getting right now, and then deducting then in those years where we have the sunset dates, and just assuming no growth in the TIF areas. So the difference between the bars and the line is our coverage on our TIF bonds, and that includes a $15 million assumed TIF bond for the convention center project. Boy, I tell you, timing is everything. Let me go to the next slide here. This next slide shows the cash flows for our consolidated TIF district for the last 3 years, and then year-to-date 2019. We still anticipate about a $5 million settlement in December. That's not reflected in that yellow box up there, which is the $14 million. But there is, so we've hovered around a $20 million fund balance. And again, that would be a secondary backup beyond the food and beverage revenue the food and beverage debt reserve fund, the net TIF revenues coming in each year, and then the TIF fund balance that we have going forward. So that's sort of the existing TIF fund balance is sort of a third backup before we'd ever even think about getting to the local income tax. Again, to Jeff's point, we're just, that lit backup is merely to get the best bond rating we can get and the lowest interest cost.
If we can go, I'll cover the next few here quickly. Again, these were to ask questions that were asked. So the next slide is just showing you by year the actual TIF revenue. This is just to show you that there are other revenue streams that come into the TIF fund, reimbursements from state and federal government, insurance payments, and those kind of things. So we wanted to present a full picture for you there. If we go to the next slide, was specifically asked about all the different areas in the consolidated TIF. So you can see all of the different sub-areas that make that up, what the base date was for setting those areas up, and then what the expiration dates are for those. So that follows up with the revenue and expenditures that Buzz talked about, showing the drops as those roll off. And again, then the majority of them roll off in 2040. Finally, the question was asked for about TIF commitments, which is the next slide. We have the 4 bonds that Buzz talked about and what those annual payments. In addition, we currently pay leases on our other 2 garages that add a commitment of about $670,000. And then, as you're all aware, we entered into an agreement to buy the current hospital site for $6.5 million. We paid $1.5 million, so we have a $5 million commitment on that, which would come out of the cash on hand, $20 million that we talked about. So, in conclusion, so even with the anticipated sunset dates of some of the TIF areas, we believe that there are sufficient funds to do 1.5 times coverage, and that still leaves $2.8 to $3.2 million in revenues left should the city decide to use those. And again, assumes no future growth in either the TIF areas themselves or in the TIF revenues. So we flatline that. We certainly anticipate that there'll be increases in those, but for the purposes of today's meeting, we just flatline that. So that just gets back to the main 2 questions. Are food and beverage funds sufficient to issue debt? And the answer to that is yes, we believe there is. And is there sufficient revenues from a TIF perspective to fund a $15 million garage? And the answer to that is yes. That assumes that there are bodies that have to approve those. The RDC in the case of TIF, as well as the City Council, and those are discussions that have only happened at a very high level. So this is for illustrative purposes only, and we would be happy to answer any questions at this point.
Thank you. We'll go around, starting on my left again. We'll begin with Commissioner President Julie Thomas.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand, there's a piece here. So we have TIF commitments on a slide, and when you list the 2015 bonds and the 2017 refunding bonds for about 3.7 in annual payments, and then I go back to the TIF area sunset dates and look at the combined bond payments, are those included, those 2 first items, are those included in the combined bond payments list?
Yes.
Okay, so then we have 2 potential, well, one that's the garage bonds for the other garages, and then the one we're talking about for the convention center, and you're looking at $3.5 million in annual payments. If I take that 3.5 in annual payments and I add it into the combined bond payment list, it seems like we're perilously close to the baseline TIF revenue and kind of zeroing out. See what I did there? I took these 2 numbers and combined them, so it's 3.5 million.
Yes,
And then I added it in here.
Yeah,
No,
so
they're already in.
They're already in these
Yeah,
numbers.
they're already in these numbers.
Okay, both of those are already in there. Okay, thank you.
And again, this is looking at a 1-year picture. The 2017 bonds are going to be paid off earlier, so this is just saying, what are the current annual commitments today? And that's the $7.26 million.
Thanks.
So the, I don't know if I have a question or not here, I got some comments. Maybe I do have a question. So the county council does not have to sign off on any, maybe this is for our county attorneys, we would not have to sign off on any bond contracts or anything like that, is what I'm hearing, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
This will all be issued to the city.
Yep. So I mean, everything to me here looks very feasible. I think it's a pretty solid financial plan from what I can tell and what we've heard here. It sounds like this is really kind of the city's decision. You know, these are, and ultimately, I think the city council and the RDC will have to make these decisions, and hopefully we can, you know, move swiftly on that and get some decisions made. You know, it saddens me that 550 parking spaces are $22,000 a piece, but you know, it's really not our decision to make, and I think the financial plan is a good one, and it seems pretty airtight to me, from what I've heard here.
Can I ask, since their bond counsel is in the room, can he answer that question about whether the county council, as the authority that passed the food and beverage tax, whether they're gonna want any sort of letter of commitment? Is Bruce Donaldson in the room? Yeah, Bruce, can you address whether there's gonna be any letter or anything, that bond that you'll require from the county council since they passed the
You'll need to
tax?
come use a mic.
Bruce Donaldson, Martin Yeah, thanks. I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing, because we've been talking about the city's tip bond for the parking garage, which the county wouldn't have any involvement with. So what was your question then?
My question is about the food and beverage tax and that bond issuance. The question that Council Member Spoonmore asked was whether there was going to have to be any sort of commitment or any input from the county council. Given the fact that the county council legally authorized the food and beverage tax, will you have to have any sort of letter or any sort of commitment from the county council, because they are the enabling body for the underlying tax that will support the bond?
Yes, I think they would need to pledge or be in agreement with the use.
Because they are the enabling body?
Well, I guess they wouldn't necessarily have to approve the use of the city's distributed share, because that's set by statute. Once the tax was enacted and now it's collected and the city gets its distributed share, then I don't think the county council has to weigh in on the city's use of its share. It's whatever it is, 89% or whatever.
For the passage of the bond, is there going to be any security that says, hey, we put this tax in place and we agree that this tax, I mean, obviously we know there's that constitutional provision once the bond is in place, but prior to the enactment of the bond, will there need to be any surety that the tax won't be sunsetted or repealed or, anything legally evidence of sense
I
of
wouldn't
assurance?
anticipate any action from the county council in that regard, no.
Okay, thank you for addressing that.
20-year or 25-year?
No, once the city's distributed share is sort of the city's to do with as it chooses at that point.
Do you have a follow-up question?
A quick, more point of order question, because there were other topics listed under the parking garage, and not all of them have been touched on. Are we planning to talk about that? Or is that,
Which ones in particular?
the C,
Discussing the one building concurrently. Well, we certainly did cover the funding sources for sure, and then construction. We didn't really touch on the construction costs so much, but
Excuse me.
not 325.
I don't think we've covered the funding sources. We've covered one funding source.
Okay.
One.
so, I mean, and I have a lot of questions about those things, that I don't want to prolong this meeting with necessarily, especially given what Councilor Spoonmore just pointed out, which is, given that the finances seem relatively in order, it's up to the city to determine the course of action vis-a-vis the garage. And as long as that's not attached to the convention center component, I guess I don't get to weigh in on it in any meaningful manner. That said, I would really encourage the city to look at alternative, not just alternative funding sources, although I think that's important, but alternative models for how they handle parking related to the convention center. It's perplexing how much parking we're adding overall across the board. And I have yet to see numbers that really support or warrant the amount of extra parking we seem to be adding. That's it.
No, thanks.
I want to reiterate some gratefulness for the information that's been given. I think this has been one of the most informative convention center discussions with numbers that I've seen in the brief time I've been on the county council and been following this generally. So I appreciate that. I look forward to what others have to ask about, but I'm grateful for that.
I got two questions. The first brief one is on this page about existing TIF resources. It appears that expenditures exceeded revenues beginning in 2018, $2 million, and now we're looking at more than $10 million in 2019. Is that from garage projects, or why is that number so lopsided in the past 2 years in favor of expenditures?
I can speak in 2018, that was $1.5 million payment for the hospital. So that we intended to pay for that out of cash. And in this year, we paid for the Bunker Robertson property with cash, and that was just under $5 million.
When you say December 2019 anticipated TIF settlement, that's money coming in, so it's going to be 11.5 million or so revenues by the end of the year?
Yes.
Okay, that's, I was misreading that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we anticipate the balance. The current, it was asked, what's the current balance as of October 20th? $14,295,000, and we anticipate another $5 million in the fall.
That's clear. A bigger question I have is, how does someone who issues bonds, how does someone who buys bonds think about the revenue that comes from a parking garage? In other words, you're calling it a revenue bond, but it's revenue from a TIF, regardless of how much money is brought in from people who actually use the garage. Can you talk a little bit about how, if at all, I guess I'm looking at the wrong guy again, sorry.
So, again, there's revenue stream bonds, and essentially you look at the risk, they look at the risk of the revenue stream. I can tell you that TIF revenues will get you a much better rating and a lower interest rate than a strictly parking garage revenue bond. So the rating agencies, investors, and the underwriters, they look at the underlying risk of each of those sources that you list as paying for the bonds. So certainly you could issue a parking garage revenue bond only, and that probably is even going to drop below a AA minus. You're probably looking at in the A range somewhere, because they associate the risk with that revenue stream as greater than a TIF revenue, because they look at TIF revenues as property tax and slightly less. So you get just a little tick off of that when you do a TIF revenue bond. So you go from a AA to a AA minus. But if you went with strictly a garage revenue bond, you'd probably be looking at an A to an A plus.
So give us a sense of, I mean, if we have, because we have a AA rating, that we would get a 3.5% interest rate, how much more interest would we be paying if we did a garage revenue only bond?
As Buzz pointed out, if we drop from a AA to AA minus, we're looking at 25 to 50 basis points.
Okay.
If you, so about every time you do that, you're going to add. So I would say you're looking at interest rates that are 1 to 1.5 times more percent-wise.
So in other words, we're looking at 4.5 to 5% instead of 3.5%. Last question I have is that when we were talking about the two previous garages that have been on our agenda, we were looking at a 22-year bond. Did my memory that correctly?
I think we said on a 20-year
Because when we were talking about it, it was pitched as a 22-year bond, and so.
That was the max, if you remember the resolution, that set maximum amounts for how much could be funded, how much could be interest rate, and how much could be year-wise.
Well, I just want to clarify, because we have this 20 and 25-year option, where did 22 come from? Is that, like, how did that maximum come about?
Well, those parameters get set way in advance of the bond sale, And we usually put a higher parameter in when Barnes and Thornburg drafts those documents. Oftentimes we'll put higher parameters in those ordinances than what we actually end up utilizing.
That's fine, I just didn't know why the higher parameter wouldn't have been 25 years like you're doing here. Is it?
Well, the other factor is on the TIF bonds, most of those are going to sunset in 2040, so we didn't want to go beyond that.
I mean, with this thing now, not with last year's.
I'd have to relook. I think.
In other words, maybe 22 years was because we were thinking about it in 2018, and it was going to end 2040, and so you picked a max of 22. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Were the revenues from actual people parking factored into figuring out how much money we need for the bond?
No, we were asked specifically if TIF was used, this is for illustrative purposes, if we were issued TIF bonds, were there sufficient TIF revenues? So we didn't factor in the possibility that net parking revenues could be used to pay the bond down and free up so it's a positive. That's the same reason we said no growth. We tried to present the most conservative picture based on the question that was asked.
Okay. What other funding sources would there be for the garage?
Well, certainly, you have the same revenue streams available to you on a garage that you would, so you have property tax backup, you have lit, you have TIF. Those are your primary streams of revenue that go out for an extended period of time. It could well be that we look at other sources of funds on hand that might buy that down, but for this purpose, that question wasn't asked and we didn't look necessarily at that. Like I said, they asked a question about the CRED. Those have sunset dates that are relatively quick. There's cash in that, so we wouldn't use that for a bond purpose other than to buy down the cost. So it would say, we think the garage is going to cost X, we're going to buy it down from $15 million to say $12 million and then bond for $12 million. We haven't looked at those scenarios. We strictly looked at if we had to sell purely a TIF revenue bond, would it be sufficient to fund a $15 million garage? And the answer was yes, it would.
So there's been no calculations or predictions made as to how much money could actually come in on the basis of people parking?
There has not been.
I think that's all I have.
It seems to me that not only are we talking about the parking garage and seeing if there's consensus of the city council to do this, because we already hear that the city administration would like to do it in a certain way. But the other thing that I haven't heard mentioned, which is something, seems to me that we would want to know in advance of moving forward with bonds, is about this hotel incentive. Where's that dollar going to come from? Or do we have, are we going to put it together with land value that we already have in place, agreement with going with tax abatements or something of the sort? Or will there be some kind of dollar amount that those dollars will have to come from TIF or some other revenue source?
Given that the discussions with the developer haven't happened, and I'm always
Thank you.
yes. Given that we haven't gotten into negotiations with a hotel developer, we tend not to put a dollar amount that's available. We look at that as a negotiation, and there are another number of other tools available to us, like you say, land value, tax abatements, other funds that could possibly be used in addition to infrastructure improvements that the city or county might make out of other pots of money that would provide those incentives. So this was strictly looking at if we issued $15 million worth of TIF revenue bonds, does the city have the capacity to do that?
I think the county would need to know whether or not someone at any point, if they're going to come to the county to ask for a portion of that $15 million. If so, then it seems to me we need to know that sooner rather than later.
So could we go to the garage bonds slide?
The stacked bar one.
The bar, the green bar, and the green line of the bars. So in that projection, the gap, could you talk about the gap between the bars and the line, and how much bonding capacity is surviving along those years in the TIF funds?
If you look at that in conjunction with the slide before, which shows the first slide, we're talking about baseline TIF revenues starting at $10.5 million and ending up at $8.2 million, and then what the combined bond payments. So essentially, the green bar is the total revenues, and then the cumulative impact with the numbers listed at the top is the combined bond payments, and the gap is the available coverage, or the difference between the two. And for illustrative purposes, we show that on a 20-year bond, that you're looking at an average of about 1.5 times coverage. So when you look at it in conjunction with that, the TIF bond coverage, that's excess revenues that would be available.
So $60 million over the life of the bonds, that there would be TIF in excess of those bond commitments.
So what kind of bonding capacity is that above what we're committing to?
Well, we're at about 150% coverage, after some of those sunsets and so forth. It depends on what happens with other new development. I think whether we would want to do a whole lot more TIF bonds until we get a little more gap in that coverage. You generally want to stay above 125% unless we were going to credit enhance the TIF bonds in some way, which we've not done historically. But
so is there room for a generous bond still to come over this time? We're not at the ceiling.
Well, again, we haven't put any new development in there. If there's a big hotel that comes in and doesn't get tax abatement, or its tax abatement rolls off in 5 or 10 years, that would be a significant, that would raise the green line up. That's one example. And then the consolidated area is pretty large. Other developments throughout the consolidated area would likely raise that line.
Short answer is it wouldn't provide a large bond with the current projections. Essentially, if there was growth in the TIF revenues and there was those additional revenues would then be available, but you wouldn't want to see this line fall below 1.25%. So there's not a lot of room for an additional bond. There would be currently a small bond issue.
Without growth, maybe 5 or 6 million. That's after the convention center garage.
Thank you.
My comment is basically like Councilor Spoonmore's. I really appreciate the detail and the answered questions from our last meeting. I know that the parking garage is a concern of everybody's, but the funding question is the city council's. And I see that you have a good TIF coverage for your bond, but I don't know about your other options, and I'll be interested to hear how you discuss this.
I really want to commend the city for the presentation. This is the sort of thing that actually, honestly, would have been useful a couple of months ago, because it really was absolutely spot on and addressed, I think, everything, all these questions asked and answered. So I really appreciate that. On the hotel incentives issue, just speaking for myself, I would definitely not be in support of any hotel incentives coming from the county, with the possible exception of land value. I would certainly not be willing to appropriate anything, any cash for land incentives from the county's perspective. Then finally, on the parking garage, I don't know if this is something that can be answered relatively quickly by the team that worked on the design, but how did that, the number of parking spaces? I hear from some counselors, some of my colleagues, oh my God, that is such a huge number of parking spaces. And then I talk to other people and think, oh, maybe we're underbuilding this. Should we really be building a much bigger parking garage? And so how were those numbers determined?
Perhaps this is a good time to have a transition into the next portion of our conversation, but I wanted to make sure if Commissioner Jones had any questions.
Only to echo everyone else and say thank you for such well-presented information.
Thank you.
No.
So let's move to the next agenda item. I know that Councilmember McKim and Munson have a presentation to discuss operational budget for the expanded convention center that you would like to present. So we
More
will
like a
talk
brief
about
discussion.
brief discussion.
We don't have any slides. In preparation for this meeting, I asked the question of the convention and visitors. Can you hear me?
No,
Sorry.
I
In
tell them
preparation
that all
for
the
this meeting, I asked the Convention and Visitors Commission President Mike Campbell to please discuss with me and Councilor McKim their view of operational costs against the revenue that comes in that handles the operational expenses of the convention center, and that is the innkeeper's tax. Along with this, there is debt payment that is an important component of their expenses. And the debt payments go on until April 2026. The payments are $646,000, $636,000 per year until that date. And looking over the long term and the increasing cost for operational expenses that will come when there is an expanded convention center, there is really no room left in the innkeeper's tax to use it for anything other than debt payment and operational expenses. And we think there is a shortfall. So, Jeff, would you like to talk about the shortfall?
Yeah, so just to kind of, okay, big picture, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. The bulk of the operations of the convention center, both currently and expanded, would be paid for by revenues from the project itself. So from sales of catering and meeting bookings and that sort of thing. So that's the majority of the, but less than 100%. And the remainder is subsidized by the innkeeper's tax. So the innkeeper's tax is going to make up the delta between the costs of running the center and the revenues brought in by the center itself. Which is, and if you look at the pro forma produced by the financial consultant that the steering committee used, that arrangement will work to the indefinite future. So we're not going to reach a time in which the innkeeper's tax will not be enough to pay the deficit between the operational revenues and the expenses. And in fact, it's after a few stabilized years, that deficit will actually decrease a little bit. The challenge is actually just a small period of time in between essentially when we start talking about an expanded convention center and when the existing debt drops off. I believe, yeah, it's half of, it's 2026, there's a half year's payment. So basically 2025. So we're talking between maybe 2022 and 2025. And there's a couple of there's a couple of other constraints. First of all, the bonds or the existing debt can only be paid off without prepayment penalty fully in 2022. I think there's a 1% prepayment penalty in 2021. If we wait till 2022, it can be paid off without prepayment penalty. And at that point, the existing debt will be about $2.3 million. And so I think basically what we're saying is that right now, that $2.3 million probably can't be covered by the existing innkeeper's tax, especially because just at the time you're trying to launch a new convention center, you're needing to market it, you're needing to, train staff, you're needing to really ramp up on your expenses, and so you don't want to be in a position where you're starving yourself of operating funds right at the time when you're trying to get a new facility started. So I don't think there's not a solution right now that we need to come up with at this moment. It's just kind of making everybody aware that there is this kind of $2.3 million operational funding hump that we need to get over before 2022, probably, to figure out a solution to that. And there are a number of different solutions. Maybe there's some refinancing options. Maybe there's wrapping it into some other debt. Maybe there might be other solutions. But basically, just kind of wanted to make sure that nobody let that drop off, that there is this kind of temporary gap between revenues and expenditures simply because of the existing debt on the convention center. Does that kind of cover it?
I think so.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Any questions from those? We can begin to my left and go around if you have any questions for Councilmember McKim-Johnson. Councilmember Hawk.
When our financial advisor worked with us and made the presentation when the county council adopted this, part of the bond, if I'm recalling correctly, was to cover the debt, the existing debt that we're paying back with the innkeeper's tax. Am I recalling that correctly? And is that no longer going to be a portion of it? Do you recall that, Councilmember McKim?
I don't recall that.
I don't, but it could well have been. I do believe, I take that back. I do believe that the assumption of his analysis was that debt would be subsumed by the new debt on the project. Right. I think we've kind of moved on since then, but I'm assuming that $2.3 million is not part of the $44 million that have been planned. So, that's not to say that it couldn't be if the city really wanted to pay the county's debt off, but.
The reason I asked that question is because I just don't want anybody looking that direction to help with the incentive for the hotel.
Exactly.
That's my point.
Fair point, yeah, fair point. Thank you.
This is why we're reporting this tonight. For those of you who would like to see a slide, ta-da. This is in your packet from the financial report.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, we can move on to discussion about the site plan itself.
Madam Chair, could I make a motion at this time? I'd like to make a motion to permit this panel to consider allowing 15 minutes for steering committee members, convention steering committee members, to share some information about their deliberations and process for both the panel and for the public.
Second. Take any questions? Take a yes.
Just briefly, if we're going to get done at 5:30 or at 8:30, are we going to have time to get through everything else on the agenda if we do this? Can we save that until the third and final summit meeting?
I think they're here this evening, and I think that they have information that would be very informative for us. So I'm offering that as, since we're all gathered here, we're all assembled, and it would be a 15-minute further.
As long as everyone's willing to stay. I don't want to require everyone to stay past 8:30. That's all I'm asking. Does anyone have a problem with this? That's the upshot.
Well, yes.
I understand there have been 9 members that have already invested a lot of time, a lot of their expertise in making the initial research, vetting, and recommendations, and I really want to hear from them because I'm very anxious to perhaps turn over some of this after the fiscal body feels comfortable with what's been presented to take it from here. So I would very much like to spend the rest of the time to hear from those members. Thank you.
Our architect is also here, and I think that's the really fun part of this, is looking at what's been designed, what the ideas are, and that would help present what we've been discussing as a committee.
Can I then ask, can we just recite what's left on the agenda and ask ourselves collectively, can those things wait until the third and final summit meeting?
I don't think we had a third meeting planned, and I think they're really important for us to hear tonight. We haven't had much public input at all in the first 2 meetings, and I'd really encourage that we listen to them tonight.
I'm not averse to it. I'm simply trying to keep an eye on what we promised our deadline would be today.
Well, the motion on the floor has been seconded. We'll do.
Is there new information being presented that we haven't heard? Is there materially new updates that we need to hear?
I think there's a lot that nobody has heard, or that most people haven't heard, except, maybe if they really followed the committee meetings carefully.
Call the question.
We'll take a vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Motion carries. So to make space for steering committee, did you say 9 people were here?
No, I said several members. I think 2 or at least 2 are here, and the motion was for 15 minutes.
So we'll have somebody, if somebody is willing to come forward and present. Mr. Murphy, come on up to the table and we'll make room for you. Be succinct, I think is what I'm hearing.
Come sit over here.
15 minutes.
We have 15 minutes, so we apologize that we might speed through this because of the time. We do want to be respectful for your time and everyone else's. We do thank you very much for allowing us to come before you and talk with you briefly. It's important. It's good to have all of you here at this table tonight. There's some great discussion and decisions been made. Jim Murphy, I am a steering committee member, the disbanded steering committee member, but I'm also a member of the Monroe County Convention Center Building Corporation. And what I want to do just briefly, I think it's important for this group. Someone just mentioned that some people have not heard this information. This has been a 30-year project. This is not something that just started recently. It's not something that started when the food and beverage tax was approved a couple of years ago. It was not started whenever the innkeeper's tax was increased several years ago. It actually started back in the mid-1980s. There was discussion of a 3-legged stool. There was a great cap and gown relationship between Indiana University and the downtown, and they needed that 3rd leg where people could meet both civically and from the university, and also attract people from outside this community. Herman B. Wells was involved with those conversations at that time. I believe Joyce Bowling was a commissioner at that time, as well as Tim Tilton and Iris Kiesling. It goes back that far. The city and the county, the county and CFC, university, we all had these conversations about how can we move forward. Much like this, it was somewhat contentious, and it's unfortunate because we are doing this for the betterment of the community, for the citizenry of this community. So what happened, Tom Daniel property became available, CFC stepped up to the plate and we acquired the property and held the property, and that was in 1989. In 1990, the community leaders petitioned that expanded innkeeper's tax I mentioned. Also in 1990, the Monroe County Convention Center Building Corporation was formed. And the purpose was for acquiring, renovating, improving, owning, and holding in fee simple the land and improvements for a convention center. In 1991, the Convention Center Building Corporation purchased the Tom O'Daniel Building, which is now where the Convention Center is located. The city of Bloomington purchased from CFC parking lot in the middle of all this property. They partnered with the county and CFC on this. In 1991, again, the Convention Center opens. Look how quick that was. From 1989 to 1991, it opened September 27th, 1991. So the pattern here is it's continuing to evolve. In 1983, the Convention Center purchased property west of the B-line for additional parking. The Convention Center Building Corporation purchases from CFC land south of the Tom O'Daniel Building for a future hotel. The Convention Center Building Corporation sells to Ashford Corporation to develop the Courtyard Marriott Hotel. Again, continued growth and development. In 2004, the CVB hires Johnson and Company to study potential for Convention Center expansion. And in 2010, not that many years ago, the Building Corporation acquired additional property east of College Avenue, which is often referred to as the Goodyear property and Napa property, and south of the existing Convention Center property down to 2nd Street, with the exception of one lot. So what you'll see here is a continuation of evolution and growth and expectation that we would expand this convention center with the parties around this table involved. I'm going to make 2 suggestions. I'm going to ask you, and I have no idea where the MOU stands, but I do know how difficult it is to get even 2 people at a meeting, let alone 20 people at a meeting. So I ask you to consider re-engaging the steering committee. I think the steering committee done a great job of gathering information, vetting information, and making recommendations to the parties, the powers to be that make the decisions. And I also ask you to consider making a decision on where the convention center expansion will be, which was recommended by the steering committee that was north of 3rd Street at the Bunker property. With that, I do ask you to reconsider those later this evening. It would be great, because I think it's time to the fish would cut bait. It's been a long time. We've got to move forward. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Valerie.
Thank you. My name is Valerie. I'm the co-chair of the steering committee. Susie Johnson was our other co-chair, and she actually did step down as we got towards the, after some decisions were made for other duties, so I have been carrying that post. I just wanted to kind of bring you a little bit of what the steering committee had accomplished and some of those types of things. As Jim mentioned, we were building off of 3 studies that were done, 2004, 2006, and 2012, on whether the convention center should even be expanded. And if it should be expanded, should it include a headquarter hotel, and should it include a parking garage? Each of those studies was done by a different organization, company, and each of them came back with very similar information. That based on Bloomington's tourism history and the ability of what the current convention center was producing in revenue and rooms, that an expansion of anywhere between 100 to 125,000 square feet would be a reasonable expansion. That a headquarter hotel would be necessary in order to make the package desirable, and a parking garage of anywhere between 500 and 800 square feet would be needed to supplement that type of size of a convention center.
Square feet or parking spaces?
I'm sorry, parking spaces, thank you. And that's based off of 15 square feet per person squared as you sit in an event, and 2.5 people per car coming to that event is how you work. That's how they come up with the formulas oftentimes. When we look at what is our maximum that we could fit in an event ballroom during an event, what is kind of that size? If you do that math, you're going to see we probably should be closer to the 800 size. But as David, our architect, has made clear to us, he said, you know, when you're in an urban setting, you get the luxury of having additional parking available throughout, and that usually you can buffer that supplement from there. So that is the reason why 500 spaces was chosen, as we feel that that was an adequate way to go. I think with that, the other thing was that we would be looking at a headquarter hotel anywhere from 250 to 350 rooms. Most likely it would be very difficult to get a hotel to commit to a 350 room size for this size of a community and this size of convention center, but 250 should be in our realm and really can add to the package. Once we began to kind of put all the elements of those things together and listening to a lot of what, you know, the success that the current convention center has, I think it's very important to really understand how unique our current situation is, that we have a center that actually can survive, pays for itself. The demand is so high that actually they are losing business. Those are elements that really drove to, we need to come to the plate and either expand this center or at some point in time realize we are going to get out of the convention business by the pure fact that we don't have facilities that can match that. And if I want to give you an example that you can relate to, when Twin Lakes Sports Park was first opened up in 1991, I actually was the one who went to go bid on a national softball tournament for 1992. We were in the construction of the park. We built it so it would be of national standards, and it was fantastic. And we have had an incredible run of economic impact from national softball because of that four-field complex, but not as of late. And we will begin to get out of the softball business because there are Westfield and all other kinds of facilities being built that are 8 plexes, 12 plexes, and all of a sudden our 4-plex is no longer desirable. That exact same scenario happens in the convention world, and that is the situation we are in right now with our current convention center at the size that it is. I think one of the challenges we have is that it's easy to forget, because of the fragmentation of the hospitality industry, to really realize in its holistic form how important of an industry it is to this community. It has been over 35 years that we have been one of the top destinations, not only in the state, but in the region. And because of that, we have had the luxury of being able to kind of cobble by with not some of the best facilities or the latest, greatest facilities, but because people love this experience. And that's what people come to conventions. If any of you go to a convention, you know the moment it's in a town where you go, oh, it's in New Orleans. Oh, it's in San Diego. But if somebody says it's in Pittsburgh, you might go, oh, it's in Pittsburgh. Not really that draw. And now you might be a Pittsburgh fan, but I'm just trying to give you the understanding that's how Bloomington is viewed in the state. And so being able to take the restaurants, attractions, and the bars, the unique shops, the hotels, and all of that, and the thousands of employees that we have, over 7,000 employees in the hospitality industry in Monroe County right now. We're talking about with an expansion of a convention center, we will almost see an automatic 500 addition to that when the hotel comes in, parking garage, and other facilities that can be built accordingly. So when you're talking about an economic generator, yes, convention centers can be that, and we are in a luxury position to be able to make that happen here. I think one of the other things I hear a lot of times is, well, yes, it's jobs, but they're low-paying jobs, and I would differ that quite a bit. We have a tremendous number of people who are in the moderate to high-pay management type positions, running attractions, hotels. We have a lot of oncoming people who are able to start in the industry in sales and other event planning, and that this industry continues to provide for this community a solid source of employment and growth. And once again, us taking care of it and understanding what our growth needs need to be to stay in that position, I think is very important. You know, economic studies are out right now, and there was a recent one done in 2017 that really showed that economically tourism right now is a $400 million industry to Monroe County, and of that, 253 million stays in this community. So an expanded convention center can be basically estimated to increase that by about $20 million coming in, that's per year, and add about another $2 million into our tax base. So once again, most of the numbers that have been presented today, they are conservative. They have talked about no growth, that no inflation, nothing. But more importantly, what we haven't covered is the potential of growth that will happen for all of the businesses around in our community because of this convention center development. So the future side of it, I think, is very important to always be looking down the path. We're smart to do conservative, but I don't want to lose sight of what the real purpose of this facility is. There's no doubt that it's a win-win for the entire community, and I think that it's important that we really get through and do that. During the search, or the committee selection, we had over 38 meetings that we were involved. Many of those, most of them were public. Very few were held in a site that couldn't be recorded. And during the charrette, we had dozens and dozens of community members who came in and gave their input to each of the designs, the location, parking garage place, whether they're a hotel or not. And many of those people were people who will be the users of this facility. They are the event planners in our community. They are the meeting planners who are committed to Bloomington in a very strong way. And I think that that's where we were able to come up with the options that we had. Then once the committee came back together and we really picked apart each of those options, the pros and the cons of each of them and what they could bring to the different side of it. Ultimately, the north location was recommended, and that was mainly due to its ability, because of the strong connectivity that it would have to downtown square, which I understand that encourages visitor exploration. It offers meeting planners an opportunity to say, hey, on your own lunch, and because we have so many restaurants within walking distance, that is a huge kudo for a meeting planner to know that they don't have to put that in their expenses. It also basically gives meeting planners a chance to kind of say, this is a community that markets 3 hotels that have connectivity to this convention center. That is over 500 rooms that could ultimately be connected. The new hotel, the current Courtyard Marriott, and the one we're not counting on if it moves to another location is the Hyatt. So the Hyatt is really at that point in time very operable to add a connector to a convention center, and the ability to go in and sell to a meeting planner that I have over 500 hotel rooms available connected to my center is a very strong selling point to from other communities. And so we have to look, it's all parts of a puzzle. And until we put that entire puzzle together and market it and sell it correctly, that's where we really have to understand how important moving something in one direction, what does that do? If we move the center to the east, we lose 172 rooms of connectivity. It's only a block and a half away, and that's not bad, except if it's snowing and it's January or February or pouring down rain. And those are things to think about. When we had the conversations with the hotelier earlier, one of the things that was important to him was the connectivity to possibly the 4th Street garage. You move the parking garage to the north side, you lose that connectivity. So we have to think of this once again as a puzzle, and the pieces are very critical of where they are placed in order to make the package as strong of a selling point as possible. Evansville has expanded and built. Columbus is looking at building. We have other communities all throughout the state they are already on the path. So we have to make these decisions. If we move quickly, we're still looking at probably 2023 before potentially we could be open, which means right now the meeting cycle is at 5 to 10 years out. So right now, until there is a spade in the ground, no meeting planner is going to believe that you're really going to build a convention center. Just as we had a hard time getting a lot of hoteliers interested in the package when we didn't have the food and beverage tax, they've heard this story from us for 30 years. We're expanding the center. Do you want to build a hotel next to it? It's not worth their time. So now we're finally we have the pieces Once we get that passed, we get the spade in the ground, we have a design. The teams that are out there selling and will sell this center can go with the prints and the premises of what this center will be and start the conversation. And may be able to start bringing in state and national conventions that would be here in 2028, 2029, 30, etc. And that's the reality of, I feel like, where we are right now. But the steering committee has been extremely effective. We have a great group of people on there, and each of them, I think, bring a very different resource to the table. So I, again, would join Jim that moving forward, having the steering committee continue to work on the design while you discuss how you want to do it long-term future of whether it's a CIB or the building corp or any of those options.
And I think that just a couple of things real quick. One, we hired consultants to work on this project, and they've been put on hold. And I don't know what their schedule looks like, but typically when you are provided a contract like that, you might not take other contracts because your time you anticipate to be spending in Bloomington, Indiana, and they're here again this evening, spending more time here. So I think we owe it to them, a fairness to them, to consider that as well. But also, I mentioned the steering committee, and I also want to throw out the possibility, because we learned this at the last meeting we had here, that the building corporation is an entity that's already in place, and that vehicle can be used as a tool to move forward. Whereas the steering committee makes recommendations to the governing bodies. If we were to utilize the building corporation and expand on that with the appropriate membership, the building corporation can do like the one that started in 1991 did, and we can expand, build, and go, and not just make recommendations, but make decisions as well with your involvement. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we went a little bit over 15 minutes. So where do we take this conversation from here? Are we asking questions of the steering committee and?
We have an architect here who has a very brief PowerPoint, and we're talking about location. I think it would be a good thing for the committee to see what he's presented, what we decided, take a few minutes. Then we could decide, are we comfortable with that location? Are we comfortable with what the steering committee has done up to this point? And it would be a good time to have the whole committee take a look at it and share some of this work, because I'm excited about the designs phase, and we're at a certain stage. We need to move on. Every day is costing taxpayer money as we just sit, and the money clock rolls. So I think it's really important to just all share together while we're here what has been accomplished by the committee, what has been decided by the community and recommended by the steering committee, just briefly, and then that's exactly what's on our agenda, and I think then we could move on very quickly to a possible motion.
My one concern is the time, and the other one is, I think we're hearing from the steering committee and they've made a recommendation. Do we need to hear what the architect consultants put forth? I mean, if we're...
I mean, isn't it really our...
I'd like to make a motion to proceed with the rough site plan, location, and project components presented by the architect.
Second.
I mean, is this really, are we not at the point where, as I heard other council members say, that this is really up to the city now? I mean, it's the city's decision, right?
I think it's also up to the county commissioners. I mean, the two executives are gonna have to agree on the site plan, I think.
I was just hearing something different, Lola.
The bonding, it's true, the bonding, but.
So motion is on, oh, I'm sorry.
I would just say, while I agree that it's up to the commissioners as well, I think maybe what the consensus is coming out is that, well, if the city council does not want to go forward, then it makes no point to talk to anybody else. Are we being asked to vote on something tonight?
Yes.
Madam Chair?
I didn't realize that we had any, I guess we're elected officials, but if there was a decision being made, that's why I wasn't sure if we were actually hearing from the architects. I wasn't aware of that. The motion is on the floor, but I didn't know how that moved the conversation forward. This was a meeting to talk about the financial aspects.
I mean, my understanding was that this is an informational meeting and the architects are on the agenda. I don't mind staying to listen to them. I did not, however, expect to vote on anything tonight. And again, it had been my impression that we were going to have a third and final summit meeting. That was after the first meeting. If it's not the pleasure of the collected body, that's fine with me. I'm just telling you what my impression was. Thank you.
Well, we do have a motion. Was it seconded? Yes. Okay. All in favor, say, oh.
Discuss the motion, or we?
Oh, we can still ask questions. Yes, we have a second.
I would like to hear the motion restated. We've had significant discussion since that motion.
The motion is simply to continue our agenda, and that is to proceed to the rough site plan location project components of the facility in question, convention center, presented by the architects.
Have presented. How long are we planning to spend on the presentation from the art? Is this something that can be done in 5 minutes?
5 minutes? 5 minutes?
Okay. I think that's reasonable. 5-minute presentation from the architects on the site plan.
I'll second the motion.
Question has been called. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We welcome the architects to please make their way to this square table. Yes, there is. Welcome.
Good evening. I'm David Greisel, principal with Convergence Design. We're associated with Schmidt Associates. Lisa Gompertz is here. And if we can get the PowerPoint up that has today's date on it, that would greatly facilitate what I'm going to do. But while that is coming to the screen, I will just say, as an endorsement of the remarks that were made by the members of the steering committee. Oh.
I will do my best.
Okay.
A nice screen.
It's one of those. I think it's that one right there.
Do it up there.
Okay.
You might be able to do it from here. Yeah, you should be able to. Can you double?
Okay. Sorry, kind of lost my train of thought there.
Can you open that PowerPoint from there?
I had a pointer, and now I don't. So I don't know where the clicker went. Sorry. Technical difficulties. We have been involved in a very intensive process that did involve a tremendous amount of public input. I think that Valerie mentioned the 38 meetings. We were in most or all of those meetings, met with hundreds, literally, of stakeholders, and those included citizens as well as potential users of the facility. Got a really good feel for what's important and less important in this community. There we go. And so, let's see if I can click. Oh, scroll. There we go. No? This isn't doing anything. Click, scroll, click, scroll. Well, let's just go with this. So in our charrette, which was a very intense design workshop back in April, we identified a large number of site plans and potential approaches to the project that included all the compass points. On this diagram that you're looking at here, whoops, yeah, there we go. There's a large number of site plans. The current Monroe Center is the blue rectangle in the middle of all these diagrams, and the sort of maroon box that you see represents the expansion, which in square footage would be considerably larger than the current Monroe Center. And then a variety of orange shapes in various configurations represent potential new hotel sites. So we looked at 7 or perhaps more than 7 when you count all the variations and permutations, different site plan configurations. So next slide. The one that rose to the top very quickly was the north expansion for reasons that I will get to in a minute. But Key things were engagement with the downtown and the square, which are literally only a block away and can be actually seen from this site. The potential connection to the Hyatt Place Hotel, as well as the Courtyard, which, as Valerie pointed out, gives you 289 hotel rooms before you even build a hotel, and would put you well over 500 with a new hotel. And the potential for a new hotel to happen on the site to the east of the current center. Next slide, please. If we can go there. Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. No, back east. Yeah, so the other option that's kind of still on the table is the east expansion. It has some of the advantages of the north expansion, but in the deliberations of the steering committee and with our consultation, we feel like the north option is a stronger option because it provides a more direct connection to the square, a more direct connection to the B line, and I think importantly, the potential of directly plugging into the Hyatt Place Hotel, which this does not have because the new hotel would be on that north property and may or may not be interested in connecting to the Hyatt. Probably, if they were a competing brand, would not be. Next slide. So I think this one's kind of been set aside for the time being, so let's move on. So here's a more detailed plan, which I'm not going to get into much detail, but where we landed, the sort of medium $44 million option that you've been talking about this evening is a 30,000 square foot multi-purpose flexible space that can be used for both exhibit and ballroom functions, which is that big purple square in the middle. Pre-function space is the yellow wrapping around that would create a very active public face to the building. And back of house support space is the blue bar on the west side that would face the B line. We're talking about some kind of a rooftop garden that would actually overlook the B line as an amenity that could happen on top of that back of house space. In the 3D diagram, the hotel is the orange blob on the left, and that circular walkway just is one way of connecting all three buildings in a kind of creative way. Next slide.
Where's the parking garage?
Oh, yeah, sorry, back up one. The parking garage is kind of hard to see, but it's tucked in behind the Marriott Courtyard Hotel in this one.
The gray box, okay.
Yeah, it's a gray box. Okay, next slide. So this slide shows a more rudimentary version of the east expansion, but at least gives you an idea of what we're talking about. We're now looking at it from the south, so you can see the courthouse at the very top of the 3D image. The east expansion would be, again, the 30,000 square foot flex space with pre-function space facing 3rd Street and facing College Avenue. Potential for expansion to the south, which is important. And the new hotel occurring north of the Monroe Center. But as I said, I think one of the critical concerns with this plan, although functionally it would work just as well, is the inability to plug the Hyatt Place Hotel, the existing Hyatt Place Hotel, into the new convention center because the new hotel site is kind of in between you there and sort of effectively blocking it. Next slide. So we can skip that one. Next slide. So just to, and I'll wrap up at this point, give you a flavor for where we're at right now. If today is October 29th, if we started design on December 1st, which I realize is perhaps slightly optimistic, you would be cutting the ribbon on this thing in June of 2022. So it takes a little while to design and build these things, and I won't go into detail in the schedule, but that's sort of where we are today. And obviously, if we move that out another month, it moves you into August of 2022. So it's just, the schedule kind of is what it is. And I'll stop at this point, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
All right, thank you so much. I probably have some questions around this table. We'll actually go the other direction. We'll begin on my right.
Thank you. Just a brief question. If the center occupied the north side, would there be connectivity to the 4th Street garage by like a habit trail or whatever we call them?
Yet there can be, there is actually an alley that goes mid-block between the 4th Street garage site and the north side that would allow you to have a direct pedestrian connection to that garage if you wanted to.
So are as I think you just called them habit trails, are the habit trails really an absolutely essential part of the design? Because I've definitely heard some compelling arguments made that just by having that kind of hermetically sealed environment, you encourage people to potentially get in their cars and drive to chain restaurants on the outskirts rather than walk to downtown. That resonates with me. So I'm curious how essential it is.
I'm reminded of FDR's famous quip that he was always looking for a one-handed economist, because this is a on the other hand kind of question. I'll put on two hats. As an urban designer and planner, elevated pedestrian walkways are a terrible idea. However, as a convention center designer and planner and a person who's spent the last 20 years in the convention industry, I can tell you that physically connecting hotels to convention centers is an absolute must, because to not do that kind of disqualifies you, and it basically takes a big chunk of your potential business and just lops it off and shoves it away, which nobody wants to do. So the urban planner in me says don't do them, but the convention center planner in me says absolutely you must do this, and you'd be crazy not to.
I'll pass.
So what you're saying then is that effectively a convention center is like a downtown mall, and that has a very particular function. Is there any study about how often people leave the mall to go shopping in the community? What data do we have about that?
Well, the data is actually really interesting around that. In fact, we did a really interesting study in Nashville several years ago where they were considering expanding their downtown convention center, which was kind of a sad little building. And people kept saying, well, what about the Gaylord? The Gaylord's this giant convention megaplex that's kind of out in the suburbs of Nashville. And what we discovered in that study was there's actually two entirely different audiences for conventions in Nashville. One was very happy to stay on site at the Gaylord and never leave the property, and they were just perfectly content with that. But the other was a market that the city wasn't even addressing, which is people who want to come to Nashville, want to have the Nashville experience, want to go to the bars and restaurants and honky-tonks in Nashville, and they were completely unsatisfied with what the Gaylord offered and were very interested in coming to a new downtown convention center. Well, fast forward 10 years, they built that center. It's called the Music City Center. It's been ridiculously successful, and they are building hotels willy-nilly around it right now in the southern part of downtown Nashville, proving that what we found in that study was actually the case.
How many are connected via habit trails to the convention center?
It has a headquarters hotel that is directly connected, and then there are literally dozens of nearby hotels that are not physically connected.
So, I mean, you sound like you're making a case against the habit trails.
In Nashville, they've been very successful without having many. The point is you've got to have at least a connected hotel, and more is better. From a sales standpoint, the more physically connected hotel rooms you can point to, in this case we're talking about 500 and some, that's a big plus from a selling side.
Last question is, does the hotel that would be built in conjunction with this expect to build its own parking, expect to use the parking we would build, or somewhere in between?
My guess is that the hotel would expect to have its own dedicated parking. Hotels tend to be very jealous of their parking and don't like to share.
That they would build, or that they would expect us to build?
I think that's a negotiating point with the hotel developer as to whether that parking for the hotel would be part of the incentive package that would help fill that financing gap.
So the 500 spaces we're talking about doesn't consider the parking in the hotel. That's 500 spaces for the convention center And that's what I've never been able to get a straight answer on is like, how much total parking are we saying is necessary to be connected to this new convention center?
Well, I think that I'm in support of the 500 space parking garage for the reasons that Valerie stated earlier, that it's a little bit less than if you were building this convention center on a greenfield site, but we're not in a greenfield site, we're in a downtown.
So 500 not including what would be in the hotel?
Not including what would be in the hotel. That would be a separate number on top of that.
Thank you. Okay.
Let me throw some things past you. Hyatt would be connected via Happy Trail. Am I saying that right, Happy Trail?
Well,
Happy Trail.
you know,
Happy Trail like a hamster.
Gerbil tube.
we derisively refer to them as gerbil tubes in the business, but you know, elevated pedestrian walkway is the proper term.
The elevated walkway. Would the Hyatt be connected via that?
That's an option. You know, that elevated walkway is probably somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000. If you ask me right now, is that in the budget or not? The answer is I don't know. We'll have to figure that out, but it's kind of on the options list.
Theoretically, the proposed or a new hotel would be connected.
Yes.
And then the garage would be not the additional garage, but garage.
Right. A new garage for the convention center would also be physically connected.
And then the current convention center would be connected as well in this design.
It's very, very important that the current Monroe Center and the new expansion be physically connected as well.
And the courtyard would just remain the courtyard.
Well, and the courtyard is already connected to the Monroe Center, so assuming we don't tear that connection down, it would still be connected.
I'm very reassured by both the fiscal presentations that have been made tonight. I think we've gotten good information about our risks and about how to mitigate those risks. I think the funding is certainly there. I'm extremely excited to hear from the members of the steering committee. I appreciate those 38 meetings. Those should not go for naught. There's a lot of passion here and there's a lot of expertise here. I am one to delegate when I know this is out of my wheelhouse, which planning for convention centers is not. I want to leave it up to the tourism professionals to tell us what is needed to make a successful convention center, and not for us to sit around and try to manage this outside of our obvious responsibilities to be good fiscal managers of this project. So I would, and again, thank you for the little tidbits on the architecture and why the Plan 1B was chosen. I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of the connectivity. The whole purpose of this and the whole economic development strategies kind of comes more into focus when we listen to the experts who have been carefully vetting and planning. They have been carefully selected by this body, the architects and the folks involved. So if there were any votes to be taken tonight, I would vote to put it back in the hands of the 9-member steering committee. And obviously, these governing bodies need to be consulted for any fiscal review. But I think in just vetting this project beyond what I think is our capabilities and our areas of expertise, and in the interest of moving this forward, I think it's kind of come to a logjam that I think many people that I certainly have talked to in the community just scratch their heads and wonder what's going on. I think our obligation is to move and to save as much money as we can by getting this thing jettisoned forward. So my sincere hope is that we turn it back to the 9-member steering committee who have spent so much time and have done so much great work, and allow us to then do the oversight and the supervision as is needed, but not to micromanage this project at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. My comments are similar to Councilmember Sandberg's. If we get started very soon, as was reported, then we could approximately open around 2022 in June, but we need to get started soon. I don't know about a next summit meeting that'll be scheduled. I don't know how we'll get to that. But I think for us to move forward, what I would like to see done tonight, and I'm just one person, but I would like to see the steering committee reconvened so they can continue their work. And I would like for us to discuss and approve funding for site plan work, design work, so we can move forward. If we can get those two things a day, and that's just me, but I think that would be a positive move forward. Thank you.
I don't think there's absolutely any way we should be taking a vote on anything. I certainly am not going to, and I don't think it's appropriate at this point. And I also think that the Capital Improvement Board is and this is you know, on the heels of the continued shout out that we give to the steering committee for all their work up to this point and their recommendation and everyone who's done so much to get us here. We're building on that. But if we have a Capital Improvement Board, we have people who can make decisions. If we have a steering committee, we get recommendations. And I like the idea much better of having a Capital Improvement Board and working toward that expeditiously. But I don't feel that we need recommendations. I think we need, if we're going to move on this, that we do need to create that board and move forward that way. Thank you.
Questions on my right?
I have a motion to make. I think we have to move on. I think we can't keep stalling. I think we can't wait for setting up a board. That's going to come. I move that we re-engage the steering committee and affirm the recommendation of the community and the steering committee with the northern site. If we don't keep moving, this is going to stop. We have to move, and that is my motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Yes, questions? We have a motion and a second. Is this about the motion, or do you want to make public comment, to make comments about the actual motion we will begin with?
And I didn't realize the last time we went around that it was also for comments. I thought it was just
Same.
questions. But I think it's related to the motion as well. And that's, I'm most concerned about public funds being used to pay for a parking garage. I have a problem with that in this era of climate change that we're paying for to subsidize people driving. I'm a little torn because I know that it's probably necessary for the convention center to be successful. I had mixed feelings about expanding the convention center to begin with, but I am not ready to commit today to supporting TIF funds for a new parking garage. Maybe there's some way that we can combine a parking garage with TIF expenditures that are for affordable housing or for pedestrian improvements, something that makes it more palatable to me as somebody concerned with climate change. But currently I'm not supportive of that use of TIF funds, and it all hangs together, right? I don't really feel comfortable saying go forward until we've resolved this question of how to pay for the parking garage. So that's how it relates back to the motion that's on the table.
Yes, okay, so we have several. We'll go this way, if you don't mind.
My question is for our legal staff. I don't know if Ms. Rice or Mr. Cockrell can answer this. I don't even know if there is even anything we can vote on legally at this meeting.
Dan Sherman and I were good question, because Dan Sherman and I were just talking this, and you will recall that the steering committee was a function of an MOU between the commissioners and the mayor. So those are the two bodies that would vote on the continuation of the steering committee. While I think this group is obviously put together and it is consistent with what the commissioners asked to have happen when they sent the memo on July 24th. And in that memo they said, hey, let's get going, let's get a CIB together because that's the way to move the project forward. I think that the vote that has to happen has to be between the executives. The councils cannot bind
the executives to do anything. So even if this majority of this entire group voted to move forward with the steering committee, if those two commissioners said no, they're the ones that are the executive for the county. So they're the ones who have to agree, because remember, the steering committee was a function of an MOU passed by the mayor and the commissioners. So, you know, I love the spirit of this project going forward. I think it's consistent with the memo that the commissioners issued July 24th. They wanted this kind of conversation and this spirit to continue because they want this project to move forward. But I just want to say from a legal perspective, we're getting a little squirrely over here because we do not think that this committee can legally bind the county executive to do anything. Or the mayor.
This is an ad hoc body that has no particular, we're a composite of folks that have come together to discuss the project, and I'll have other comments later, but I think at this point, we're just asking for a sense of the group. There's no question that this group can't bind any of us to that, but as a sense of a group, I think we're trying to get a sense of how to recommend going forward, and I would agree that this is not a binding vote on any of us. It's just trying to get a sense of this group, which was gathered at the county's request to discuss items and how to move it forward, and I think we're trying to get a sense of that through this motion. And I have other comments, but I'll save those for later.
I could amend this to make it a recommendation. My motion is that we recommend that the steering committee be reconvened and that the choice of the north location be affirmed. That is a recommendation of this body.
Okay, and then
Can I make a comment?
no, Councilmember Rowland has.
No, I'll defer to my colleague.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a comment. When this is and I'm new to some of this. When we started this, I think we were talking about information about funding and things were going very well. And we were having a lot of agreement and hard to find disagreement. And then we got into some more particulars and some processes, and then we found some of the things that we cannot reconcile. Now, I love this project. I think it's absolutely necessary to strengthen the core of the city, and which then strengthens our county and helps our people. But it occurs to me that the steering committee has done tremendous work. They make a great case here, but the issue is that the steering committee, with the composition in the form that it currently is in, has brought the ball up to a good point, but they don't have on their own the juice to get this done. It takes the political buy-in of the executives to work out, where they're at on it. And I have a concern here that if we have executives that are not getting to that point, where do we go with that, and how do we get it? And so before we jump into the next thing here, I would just say that I think that our discussion point and what we were doing before, we were headed into some decent directions, and it takes that discussion to get to the solution that we're going with and to. I think when we force things around here, that's when we get into problems around here. Just an observation.
I'll take my turn now, thank you. Councilmember Deckard, as I suspected, echoes my thoughts almost entirely. I was under the impression. I am sure. I was under the impression that these meetings were an effort by the collective councils to sort of, join the discussion that the executives were having about this issue. I must also say that I have to echo the thoughts of Councilmember Piedmont Smith. I am primarily and vitally concerned with how a parking garage will be paid for. Let no one misinterpret my opinion. I have been supportive of a new expanded convention center for years. I've never been against it. I do have very hard questions, not just from an environmental perspective, but from an urban perspective about the merit of a new garage, how many spaces, how it's related to the hotel, because if you look at the Morton Garage and the Hilton Garden Inn, they share a garage, and that's a possibility here as well. And these questions, I didn't expect them to be fully answered tonight. I certainly did not expect to have to address a motion tonight. I believe such a motion is out of order. We've already sort of departed from our agenda. Certainly we departed from the time of the agenda. The presentations took longer than was advertised just before they were made. So, with all due respect to my colleagues, both in the executive and in the legislative, who are enthusiastic about the project, I join you in being enthusiastic about the project, but there were questions that needed to be answered. They're only now, tonight, getting fully answered. And I did have every reason to expect that there was going to be a third such meeting. And in fact, that meeting was going to be the appropriate place to make motions, to prepare them, to have them on the agenda so that they could be in the packet. Normally, our council is very careful about having everything in the packet, everything ready and written out. So this rush here to decide already, it's, I also understand the enthusiasm of the steering committee. I understand that this history goes back more than 28 years, and yet one more meeting is not going to kill us. I will remind you that the first meeting was September 16th. I was not the one who scheduled the October 29th second meeting. I would love to have had it sooner, but our council had so much stuff on its agenda through no action of my own that this was as soon as we could meet. So, it's not by my applying brakes that we're taking so long to decide. And I thought that after the first meeting, we had some really, as Councilor Deckard said, we had some really good, understanding going. And I want to fully understand the question before I'm asked to vote on it. I think every member here should feel that way. And I'm sure I speak for many people in that respect. Thank you.
Councilmember Rowland.
To be brief, I just, on our agenda this evening is mentioned recommendations. And so it's perfectly appropriate that we do, I think, at least, and what I'm suggesting is, and it's already been said, that this is not, this vote wouldn't be binding. But the county council, two councils are meeting. County council initiated the tax. The city council is going to decide an appropriation related to it for the convention center, or not. But it's very important, I think, from my point of view, to hear the sentiments of where we are at this point, given the information that we've been presented. This is very rare that we meet, and that would be very helpful, I think, to find out our particular sentiments.
The agenda says timeline, next steps, and recommendations. Clearly, it was not expected that there would be things we'd be voting on tonight. We're just talking about what the next meeting might be, the timeline for decision. So that's it.
And we've also skipped quite a bit of the agenda if we go right to recommendations.
It does sound like perhaps a third meeting is needed. I don't know how I feel about that. It was mentioned previously that there would be a series of 3 meetings, as I'm hearing from a couple of people. No?
No.
No.
This group is really hard to get together. Your schedules are very difficult. We have, I appreciate everyone's time in doing this, and we have had very good discussions and learned good information about this. From my perspective, we've had about a 5-month pause in this project. I think there are definitely issues still to be worked out on the governance and ownership, and that is a topic to be considered, and I'd be happy to suggest that we have another recommendation, that is that the executives in their teams continue to explore a capital improvement board or other options for governance, because I think that's something we absolutely need to do. And I think it would be fine for this group to recommend that and encourage us to work together on that. I think from my perspective, again, this is a very difficult group to get together. We've had a very successful steering committee on behalf of all of us. There's one of each of the 4 bodies that sits on that steering committee, each of the 4 public bodies, and then 5 private citizens who've put in untold hours to recommend moving this forward. And I think, to me, the people of our community have, in the vote to create a tax, have said we want an expanded convention center. That was what that vote was for. We have a process to do that. We have a lot of decisions to make, and let no mistake, this vote tonight, if you were to support a steering committee being asked to go forward, recommended, and a site plan as described, does not suggest that how the garage should be funded. That is not part of that. That comes back to the funding body that will have to decide how to fund that garage. It's way too early. All we did tonight was find out we have money to do this project, and these two potential sources, there may be more to look at. We're not trying to decide that tonight. I urge, in order to move this project forward, that we do indicate as a group, do we want the steering committee to keep working? That group, which has done very good work and has been put on pause, we can't order it to be done because that has to come from the collaboration of the two executives. Do we want to say, let's move forward with the design continuing to work while the governance work happens? Because I'm concerned that if we pause longer for lots of reasons that have been discussed, we're putting this project at risk unnecessarily. There's 100 decisions still to be made. But what we learned tonight, I think, very positively was the funding is there, two options, different options. There may be other options we'll look at, and we don't need to decide that tonight. And I think we heard the rationale for moving forward with the steering committee and with the site plan to then begin the work of design, to begin the work, and I'd be happy to propose an amendment if you want, or either amend or a new motion to encourage and recommend that the governance be investigated intensively on a capital improvement board. That won't be quick, it's not going to be simple, but it's certainly something that we look forward to working on. So I hope we can move forward to this, and I'm afraid that if we wait for a third meeting, it'll happen next year. It's very difficult to do. City Council is incredibly busy.
Councilmember McCann and Councilmember Munson.
So I certainly do support moving ahead with the steering committee. So if there's a vote on getting the steering committee moving, I'll certainly support it. But it's kind of meaningless if the executives don't agree to accept the recommendations that have already been made. We've got to moved beyond that roadblock. And that roadblock isn't going to be redoing the same thing or re-arguing the same thing. So, I agree. It was a pain that it took so long to schedule this meeting. But these meetings have been incredibly productive. And at this point, I'm thinking the best thing would just be to schedule one more meeting as quickly as we can, where the number one topic is going to be arguing out that site plan issue, because we've heard the consultant's recommendation. I've also heard the commissioners make a passionate and cogent case on behalf of the other alternative, the east alternative. And it's clear from the consultants that both options are viable. But the steering committee's done a great job of eliminating all the non-viable options, but we do still have two legitimate options to consider. And I think it's worth investing that a little bit of extra time if there's a chance of getting the county and city executives together on a plan that'll actually work. That is worth a lot. So yes, steering committee, but I think we are still going to have an additional meeting to get over that hump, where we don't get distracted by other things earlier on.
As a member of the steering committee, we already made a recommendation to the executives. I don't know what more we can do except make a recommendation to the executives about the site plan. What we haven't touched on was the importance of moving very quickly on the capital improvement board. And I'm not sure we need a steering committee meeting to say we need to get going on this as quickly as possible.
Staff.
And I'm happy to serve again if there is a steering committee meeting. I'm happy to join you all at a third meeting. I just want to be logical in our choices.
When the memo was issued in July, I think the introduction to it made clear that the steering committee had been doing really valuable work and we really appreciated all they had done. But we were kind of stuck and not moving forward at all. So we actually had recommended that we discuss a capital improvement board as a means of moving forward, which really, it makes sense for that to be the next item of discussion. Once that's settled, then everything can move forward really easily.
We are absolutely excited about talking about a capital improvement board, move forward. We have a lawyer who can talk about it. It is not a simple process. We worked long and hard to create a steering committee together, and I don't expect it's going to be simple from the city and county sides to create a capital improvement board that actually has power to do these activities. I think it's absolutely, and again, I would support a motion to recommend immediate and intensive work on that governance body to look at that. I think that would be, frankly, it's helpful from the executives to hear the push on this from you all, and I would endorse a push on all three things. Get that steering committee back together to work on the design, let them work with the site plan A, and get focused on how are you going to govern this thing. Those are all three things that can happen in parallel and will help this project move forward.
So we do have a,
We have a motion on this.
so we do have a motion on the floor, and can you repeat what that is?
It is to reconvene the steering committee. It's to recommend that we re-engage the steering committee and recommend that the administrators affirm the recommendation from the steering committee on the choice of the north location.
Yes.
You are not one entity. I think you are 4 entities. And if I'm going to, there's enough council members here to take a vote. I just want to inform the members of the city council that it will take 5 votes for this to pass among the council members. If it's less than 5, the motion fails in terms of the will of the council. So.
It's just an ad hoc body that we're asking for a sense of all in the room, not split up into different bodies, but.
Here's the thing, Mr. Sherman makes a good point. If we were prepared, if I had expected, for example, to vote on a motion or a resolution, I would have liked to know that on the agenda. At a third meeting, we could prepare an actual resolution that the council could vote on in front of our peers. The county council could do the same. I'm committed to bending my schedule to fit something in before Thanksgiving. Thursday the 21st looks like as good a date as any to make sure we have enough time to prepare all the motions that people are concerned with that would actually be binding on the council if they were, properly prepared. The decision of a capital improvement board was on the agenda, but we didn't have any presentation on it. That could be part of the final summit meeting that I expected to hear anyway, to attend. So I would rather see these motions formalized and that we could take a binding vote as city council members on them at that final meeting. Slowly.
Slowly make a suggestion that we reconsider the motion, since the implications as stated by Mr. Sherman seem to be quite profound, that we might consider reframing that motion to recommend that the executives come together to work on a CIB and then report back at a future meeting.
Well, and keep the other two parts of it.
Yeah, there's another motion on the floor already, and this is all messy.
I think it should include that, because Commissioner Jones is...
And I'm going to move to separate if we really do want to take a vote, because I think those are two separate issues anyway. So I'd rather not take a vote on this at this point. It's gotten messy enough.
I'd like to ask council, isn't this an independent body that was created? Why is it, you mean if the council, do those same rules apply to the council, the county council, if they make their rule? If they make a vote, they have to have their majority.
Right.
And we have to have our, so we're a dual meeting, is that what you're saying we are?
Yeah.
Okay.
We noticed this as a meeting of the county council, the city council, the joint meeting of you guys.
I guess I was just overly optimistic. I thought everyone was so worried about the money, and the money's not an issue. I think everyone got that. So I didn't realize there was still a fight about the location. I thought the committee's been working on this. We've had experts come in. There's so many good reasons for that to fit where it fits. And I thought the presentation by our architect, the way it blends with the downtown, the way it creates a new face block along that block face to integrate the downtown. I thought, okay, we kind of get that, and maybe we could send a message to both our administrators, let's get together and make this happen for the community. And I thought this could just be a way that we could make a recommendation to get moving, because it's costing lots of money and it's wasting lots of time, and there are always reasons to not move forward. But there got to be reasons to move forward, and there are very good reasons to do that. And I'm just saying, is there a motion that could express that? And if not, I will withdraw my motion and let someone else make a motion that can function in this body, this dysfunctional body, I'll say. Thank you.
Did we have a third meeting?
Sure.
Margie, I think one of you is go around. You can go around the room, and each one of you can express your opinion, and someone can do the count. That's the sense of the body. It's not a vote, but they can hear from all of you, and they'll draw conclusions. So, if the topic is very narrow, in other words, don't go broad here. So maybe the motion is withdrawn, but you can say that was a good idea or that was a bad idea, and go around the table, and you'll have a good sense of where you all stand.
I will withdraw my motion.
How about we do that on the three topics, one at a time? Do you want to encourage the steering committee to reconvene? Do you want to move forward with the site plan as recommended and be moved forward? And three, do you want to recommend that the governance be pursued aggressively by the executives? I mean, that would work to go around and just say how you feel about it.
Do them separately.
Okay. The first one would be, do you want it, this will take 3 minutes. Do you want to recommend that the steering committee be reconvened? I would say yes.
Or, let's recommend that our next meeting's going to be, which I think we've all agreed we're going to have, that third meeting like we talked about, and we can discuss this amongst ourselves. So, the city council can make a decision before then if they wish to, and bring that recommendation. But if we've already decided we're going to have that third meeting, let's just get that on the table when that's going to be, and let's move forward that way, because we have to work together to get it to move forward. And if anybody feels like they're getting caught up in being forced to make a decision they weren't prepared to make, that doesn't make good relations for us to continue to work well together. And I really thought this evening we were almost there, we were doing really well. And I'd like to stand there.
And I think we have a lot of things that we are excited about, and so I'm not sure we can go around the table, but I don't know if there is a desire to have our, opinions heard. Mr. Bullen?
I may express my opinions about the questions the mayor presented, and I'm interested in doing so, but I'd simply like to suggest that we have our third meeting on Thursday, November 21st. And I wonder if that's, we can figure out tonight whether that's a date that would work. I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to do whatever we're going to do.
And we will begin with Mr. Sturbaugh, since it was sort of his motion to begin with. It's three things. Three things.
The committee affirm the support the northern movement and encourage that we move ahead on the CIB. 1, 2, 3.
Are you starting?
Is that it?
What's your answer?
That's,
Oh,
What's your answer?
What's your answer?
He just gave his answer.
no, those are yes to all those three.
yeah.
I thought you were just telling me the option for, okay. Ms. Munson.
I was doing both.
Yes on the steering committee, if it'll be helpful. The site plan, it was already recommended by the steering committee, and I will affirm that it was done. And the CIB aggressively, yes, we've been talking about this, some of us, since before there was a steering committee. Please, move.
Steering committee, yes. Schedule one more meeting to come to agreement on the site plan. So I guess that would be a no, but it's a no specifically saying make the decision at the next meeting of the whole. And have the executive and staff explore CIB immediately, yes.
I don't think that it's very appropriate for me to take a vote at this time.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes, steering committee going forward, favorable to the site plan, and I would, yes, highly recommend that the executives work on governance.
Yes, I'd like to see the steering committee move forward and would like to have a third meeting to be able to discuss, hear from the commissioners, hear this this other option, the east option more fully, and have the CIB, however the staff needs to work together to get this moving. I think it absolutely needs to happen yesterday, but yes.
No comment.
I vote yes for all three, and I also think another meeting is not going to be very productive unless it's with the executives.
I will recommend another meeting. I'm just not ready to pass a recommendation on any of the other items. I do feel comfortable with the funding aspects, but the site plan and so forth, I feel is just a little bit out of my purview, or I'm just not prepared as much as I would like to be to make any kind of recommendations on that.
I think that it's fine. I support having the steering committee continue to meet if they have something that they can discuss. I think that the site plan should be postponed to another meeting. I think it would be beneficial for us to be able to use that meeting to get some more clarity on the options. And the CIB needs to happen, so yes on that. And at some point, I'm really hoping someone will explain the difference between the CIB and the building corporation. Throwing that in there, a little pitch.
Yes to the steering committee, and out of respect to the work and the expertise of the steering committee, yes to the site plan. Also yes to the governance, and with all community urgency, please.
I like this process, by the way. This is back on track. First, yes to the steering committee reconvening if it'll help. They've done everything but put bricks and mortar out. So if it'll help and keep us moving, yes to the executives and/or us exploring a CIB. I think it's got strength to it, and we won't be in meetings like this because they'll have strength to it. So yes to that. Location, I'm cognizant that that strength question comes back to executives having a moment to have that discussion and make their case and then coming to an agreement. And I'm good with another meeting exploring that and exhausting that in the public's mind. And then we can have strong recommendations for that, or bodies can have recommendations. But again, I like this process that we're using here because it feels like we're doing something and moving back on track.
I can't say yes to the steering committee meeting again because it seems to me that it's mooted by the question of a capital improvement board or a building corporation. Councilmember Wills took the idea out of my head. I want to know the difference. I want to fully understand the difference between a capital improvement board and a building corporation. And it seems to me that either one that we choose would supersede the need for a steering committee. Like, that's kind of the point. And with respect to the site plan, while I still am slightly more in favor of the north one than the east one, I agree that we don't have enough to fully decide that now, and that it should be one of at least 2 formal items on the agenda written out that we can vote on, even though that vote is not binding. It could be binding if we want it to be, if we were to have that meeting, say, on the 21st. But it should be in writing that we're recommending a particular site plan. And between now and then will give us the time to study and fully understand these questions. And I am committed to meeting anytime before Thanksgiving, as long as we have enough time to draft these motions in a proper way that we can all study before we get to the meeting. Thank you. Pardon me? Do you want to express your opinion now?
No, I said that was 3 no's.
No, it wasn't.
Nicole, do you want to say something?
Oh, no.
For the steering committee, I don't really know what they would do, and I do have a major question about the parking garage, and that really, in my mind, needs to be addressed before the steering committee or anybody else moves forward. So I suppose that's a no on the steering committee meeting. I do respect the work that they have done, and so it's a yes on the site plan, the northern site plan. Pursuing some sort of separate governance, definitely. I have from my notes from our September meeting that building corporation is a more flexible entity than a CIB. That's all I can tell you. Okay. And yes, definitely for a third joint meeting, but please not on November 21st. That's my birthday.
Okay. I'm very interested to see if maybe the executives could come to an agreement where the location is to be, because I certainly am not in a position to try to tell the elected officials what their decision should be, because that, that's really going to be up to the county commissioners to decide for the county where that location is going to be. It'll be up to the mayor. So those folks need to come together, and the steering committee can meet all day and all night, and it's still going to take those folks to make the decision. I think that's what we heard from our council staff and attorney. So I would encourage them to do that. When we left our last meeting, I felt like it really was in the city's ballpark, because what the thing that was most missing at that point that was really going to be a sticky wicket was whether or not the city council was going to support that parking garage. That's where I thought we were up against it, and that if we came together and talked across the table, we would know whether or not the city council was ready to move forward with the parking garage or not. And I still haven't heard that yet this evening. Maybe by the third meeting, you folks will have made that decision. But I really don't think that's up to the county council. The fiscal issues we're discussing is really the city council.
Thank you.
Shall we adjourn?
So I think we will look at your calendar, see if November 21st, except for Isabel Piedmont Smith, it appears, listening to different people talk about that date, it might be one of the only dates that are available.
Shelley Yoder.
But I think that we do have some next steps. We will send out minutes from this meeting to everyone so we can look at those. We'll look forward to hopefully a third meeting, and definitely conversations about a CIB. That vote was unanimous, so we can agree on something. Thank you so much for giving your evening for this conversation. I think we did move it forward, and I think it was an important. Some questions were answered, and Mr. Rowland?
I just want to say thank you to Shelley Yoder for her service. And if this is your last meeting, sorry about that, but thank you for all your service.
Thank you. And our community is going to have continued conversations about this, but this meeting is adjourned.